Now, in this course, we have focused mainly on LINQ to objects, although most of the principles and techniques we've learned apply to other LINQ providers as well. And as we've said, LINQ is an abstraction, and in theory, that means you don't need to worry about how it's implemented under the hood. But when you're working with Entity Framework, you need to be aware that your LINQ pipeline is at some point going to be turned into one or more SQL queries. And I'm sure you know that it's quite possible to write very inefficient SQL queries. And so if LINQ to entities is generating SQL on our behalf, how can we be sure that we're getting the best performance possible? Well, there's a number of best practices for getting good performance out of your SQL queries that hopefully you already know if you work with databases. A few of these main principles are: first, when you're designing your database schema, make sure you define appropriate keys and indexes to allow the database to perform your queries efficiently. Second, don't pull down any more data than you need to from the server to the client. And this includes not retrieving more rows than you need to, but also not more columns than you need to either. And third, it's usually much better to construct a single query that retrieves all the data you need rather than making multiple queries. Now, since this isn't a course on database design, we won't cover the first of these principles, but the second two do relate very much to how you write your LINQ queries. And so we're going to look at a few examples of inefficient ways you might construct your LINQ to entities queries, and then look at some ways to improve the performance. But before we do that, we need to answer an important question. How can we find out what SQL statements are actually being executed by our LINQ queries? Now actually, I already showed you how you can do this using LINQPad in our last module. It's got great built-in support for querying databases, and it's actually built on top of LINQ to SQL, which was the predecessor to Entity Framework. And it automatically generates model classes from the schema of any SQL database you connect to. And so when you use LINQPad to run a query like this one, we can switch to the SQL tab and see what the generated SQL is. But how can you do that with Entity Framework? Well, with Entity Framework 6 and above, there's a very easy way. You can simply assign a method that takes a string to the database.log property of your context object, and then you can use that to log the SQL in any way you like. So here I connect to a database and set up the log method to write to the console, and then when I run a simple query, we can see here in the output that the SQL that was generated from our query, as well as some other useful information about when Entity Framework opened and closed the database connection and how long the query took to run, is displayed in the console. And so now we know how to see what SQL statements are running. Let's have a look at a few pitfalls to avoid when we're constructing our LINQ to entities queries.